Before I dive in to what I want to talk to you all about today, up on the screen you'll see a slide with one of our little magic QR codes that I just found out about a few weeks ago. Very cool. But what this is, we announced it a few weeks ago. We are entering into a partnership. We're hoping it is a multi-year relationship with Bethany Christian Services, one of the few Christian adoption and foster agencies in the country that does not discriminate against the LGBTQ community, which is important to us. But they are piloting a program where they are offering temporary foster care hosting for refugee and migrant children so that they don't have to stay in detention centers while their parents, guardians, and sponsors are processing refugee immigration status. And we're going to have lots of different ways to plug in over the coming weeks and months and hopefully years into this program and kind of come alongside and support them, some of which are going to be kind of rolling out via social media and our announcements and things like that starting this week. But just wanted to plug this once again and remind you, if you fill out the form on the app or take a picture of this QR code, you will go on to sort of like a stay in the loop list, and we'll get regular updates. There's going to be things that we're going to invite the whole congregation, the whole community into, but if you want like specific updates about ways that you can help out with this, then I encourage you to take a picture of that and fill out this form. And that's it on that for this morning. Yeah, so Loose Blocks, our brand new series that we kicked off last week. I sort of made an executive decision this morning. Surprise, surprise, Matt and Scott. I'm not sure if they're in the room anymore, but I said, oh, you know what would be fun if we named all of the sermons or talks or whatever these things that we do are called, when we put them like up on YouTube, if we named them kind of like they name Friends episodes, like, you know, the one about, so I don't know what Matt titled his talk last week, but we changed it. Matt, we changed it. It's last week, that one's the one about church. And that's kind of what this whole series is about. This series is, you know, people are probably going to remember it. They're not, I don't, Loose Blocks is clever, but they might remember it as the one about church. And today, I'm doing the one about salvation and baptism. Not all that big of a deal, you know, in the grand scheme of things, but that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's a tough one. It's a tough one. We'll see how I do. Well, we'll see. Don't tell me afterwards. I want to kind of just assume that everything went really, really well. But I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago when I was up here. But a few weeks ago, I was in South Bend, Indiana, at a conference of sorts for post-evangelical church leaders, which I guess probably more or less describes me and some of you, perhaps. I don't know why I was in South Bend. I said that before, but not really where I imagine, you know, kind of like a hub of post-evangelical church leadership energy would typically seek to congregate, but that's where it was. And there was a Washington Post reporter there. It was actually kind of fun. She sat down next to me, and I was like, I know her from Twitter. That happens a lot, actually, meeting people that I only knew from Twitter. Welcome to the 21st century, I guess. But she wrote an article, and guess what? I got quoted. I'm in the Washington Post. I'm famous now. But I kind of got misquoted. The words I said or were purported to, I said them. Like she got the words right, but it was, and there was no malice here, I know, but it was kind of lifted out of the context of what I was saying and sort of reframed. So let me just give you the actual context. We were sitting at a little round table, and we were sort of discussing the merits, all right, can't walk there, discussing the merits of what was happening, this conference, and this question of post-evangelicalism, what even is it? You know, like there was this broader combination of like non-denominational quasi-Baptist folks, you know, who kind of became evangelicalism, and then some stuff happened, so a lot of us, you know, some of it was political, some of it was theological, and we were like, we can't really be a part of that anymore. So, but you know, we don't want to like burn everything to the ground, so, you know, maybe we're post-evangelicals as opposed to ex-evangelicals, but that's also fine too. And anyway, and I raised the question in the space. I said, don't get me wrong, there are actually some really meaningful things historically about evangelicalism that I think are worth naming or retaining or reclaiming, you know, kind of whatever language you want to use. But I do worry about the sustainability of this. And are we inadvertently smuggling some of the toxicity that many of us experienced into these new expressions that we are trying to imagine. Now, I hope that's not true, and I genuinely look at a place like this, and I mean, not just because it's my literal livelihood, but just in general, I believe in what we're doing here. Perhaps more than at any point in my 10 plus years in vocational ministry, I believe in what we're doing here. But sometimes I wonder, is this just kind of like a halfway house where we're all kind of like catching our breath before we go on to whatever the actual next thing is? I hope not. And just, so I and the rest of the team here, and hopefully many of you, are committed to making it much more than that. But we have an opportunity then, and perhaps an obligation, to create it, to make it lasting, meaningful, sustainable. And that includes perhaps reimagining and reclaiming and sometimes straight up just inventing what it means to be the church here, both here in the 21st century, here in Charlotte, here within the however many walls of this building, and here together. And so that's kind of what this series is about, and sort of reflecting on how we do that. Salvation and baptism came up in my head. Like I said, not necessarily minor facets of this thing that we call faith, or this thing that we call Christianity, if we still call it that. And I got thinking, my own baptism experience in a Baptist church, of all places. I was young, old enough. This was important for the Baptists, at least my old Baptists. It was important that I be able to understand what I was committing to, what I was doing. So I took a class with good old Donna Nelson. She had also been my third grade teacher. This was later. Very old, but she did a great job, I think. I don't really remember. And but the purpose of the class was to make sure that I knew what I was affirming, committing to, saying yes to. It would be later that non-denominational churches more broadly, adopted the language of saying yes to Jesus. This was the 90s, so we hadn't gotten that far yet. And so I took this class, and then afterwards I got in the tank, and we had it in my old church, it would have been where the drums are. Everyone could see it, and it was a big bathtub. And we didn't have projector screens yet. That came later. And so I was in there, and Les McGee, still alive. Man, bless his heart. I love Les. Les McGee, he asked me some questions about affirming Jesus and the Trinity and stuff like that. And I said yes to all those, because of course you do. I mean, what happens if you say no? That's awkward. And then they dunked me under the water, and then afterwards I think I got a Bible and ice cream or something. But here was what I struggled with. I was in a denomination, I was in a setting where they really, really, really wanted to emphasize that what was happening wasn't going to save me. And to be clear, what they meant by salvation was not going to hell. The thing that made me not going to hell was the magic incantation that I had prayed, at this point probably coming up on triple digits, I don't know, 102 times at this point. I would go on probably a couple thousand more, because the prospect of hell is terrifying. And something about saying a prayer that you get really no actual, tangible, visible confirmation for afterwards just didn't really feel like it was sticking, So I would go on to do that. And I guess maybe that's what baptism is. It's to give you something to cling to point back to, and be well, yeah, I mean, I just kind of said some words, but that was special. Everyone clapped for me, and, they were pretty stoked. So that must have been the thing. But of course, this denomination was no, that's not the thing. This is a visible expression of an inward change. The inward change already happened. This is purely symbolic. And I don't know if that was the framing you grew up with. Perhaps you grew up in a denomination that actually saw the act of baptism itself as the saving act, or maybe you were Presbyterian or Episcopalian or Catholic, and so you didn't really have a whole say in the matter. You were a baby. Actually, I also had that happen, so I'm double baptized, so super saved, because I was Presbyterian, and then later I guess we found Jesus, but. There was something about the fact that it was presented to me as purely symbolic, and I was kind of so it was performative? I don't like arbitrary things. My wife is constantly telling me what I'm supposed to wear, fashion-wise. Apparently there was some people I'm not going to name their names, but they were thinking about going like as me for Halloween, because apparently I have got a very predictable style, fashion-wise. Usually involves flip-flops, but haha, not today. And probably this shirt. So predictable, in fact, that this is actually the first Sunday in 3 weeks that Des and I'm pointing at Des, he's right here if you can't see him, he's taking a picture of me right now. It's the first Sunday in 3 weeks we haven't been matching. So that's fun. But anyway, the point is it didn't stick. Like according, like theologically, I was told it for sure stuck, but it didn't feel like it stuck. And so I kept praying and I kept praying and I kept praying. Fast forward to now, and there was all this deconstruction-y and stuff, and I studied a bunch of dead German guys who wrote about God a lot and learned a little bit of Hebrew. Pete Enns, who you saw in the video, and I highly encourage you to come hang out with because he is incredible. He played a big part in some of this reconstruction, reclamation, things like that. Anyway, here we are today, together and digitally with all of you. And I have to ask, okay, so what does this mean? What does it mean to be saved? And if in fact we can achieve that, sounds good, then this whole ritual of baptism, which by the way, I've worked at Watershed coming on 4 years now, been at Watershed a little over 5. We haven't done one, like a baptism, since I've been here. And I don't say that dismissively. Baptism is a huge part of this community story. Many of you have heard about our journey to become a fully affirming and inclusive church to the LGBTQ community. You may have heard the name John Nance, just a pillar in this community, and his story and leaning into the Watershed community and to Matt and Scott, which helped bring us along in that journey and just change our convictions on that front. It involved baptism. It used to make sense. So is there a way for it to make sense again? That's sort of the question I'm wrestling with. And so I got thinking and kind of thought through some of the passages related to this biblically. And one that has always stood out, and it's one of my favorite passages in the book of John. Many of you are familiar with it because it's John chapter 3, arguably the most famous chapter in all of the Bible. It's where John 3:16 resides. Many of you can recite it, probably in the King James Version, because that's how you were taught in your head. I'm not actually going to talk about it today. I just kind of wanted to set the context. But John 3, what's happening here? So Jesus has been doing cool Jesus stuff. It's the book of John, which is the one that includes turning water into wine, so people were pretty excited about that. That had already happened. And so Nicodemus, he's one of the religious leaders, I believe a Pharisee, which is one of the different, for lack of a better word, denominations within Judaism at the time. You had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, you had the Essenes, you had the Zealots, you had stuff in between, kind of like we have all the different versions. And Nicodemus is showing up, and he's like, "All right, Jesus, Rabbi, obviously you are from God. You're doing all of this super cool stuff, but unpack it for me. Some of this stuff isn't landing with me. Just lay it out for me. Say it to me like I'm 5. It's not actually what he said, but it's basically the gist of it. All right, can't step there. And so Jesus kind of picks it up. It'll be on the screen. I kind of needed to be on the screen because I want to read it. Yeah. So Jesus replied, "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." I bet some of you have been told or have thought of yourself over the years as being born again, kind of a fraught term. So unless you were born again. So then Nicodemus responds, "How can someone be born when they are old?" He asks. "Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." So he's taking things just really literally, like a 5-year-old. So Jesus answered. Next slide. "Very truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You, of all people, should not be surprised at my saying you must be born again. The wind blows where it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit." What is he talking about? What is he talking about? So let me give you some context for the book of John. Book of John was written probably pretty late in the first century, maybe even beginning of the second century. So like 90 AD, maybe into, 100 something AD. So kind of late in the game. This is 60, 70, 80 years after Jesus walked the earth, okay? And so this Christian community, they were probably kind of calling themselves Christian at this point, but it had begun to transition past the point where they saw themselves as just like another one of the Jewish denominations. And in part, what was changing is two things. One, a lot of non-ethnically and religious Jewish people had been adopting this faith, adopting this practice, adopting this way. And that was actually kind of part of the whole game. That was Paul's big thing, was trying to make this accessible for people who are not ethnically or religiously Jewish. Most of Paul's letters in the New Testament are written in an attempt to sort of reconcile those things, when it comes to things like circumcision and food laws and holidays and the Sabbath and things like that. That's most of what Paul is sort of concerned with. And so there'd been a lot of like non-Jewish kind of Gentile people coming into this faith, but then even amongst the Jewish people in the faith, there had been conflicts. There had been conflicts with the other Jewish denominations, and then there had been conflicts with the Romans. And really, the conflicts with the Romans had culminated 20, 30 years prior in the destruction of Jerusalem, and crucially, the destruction of the temple. And then even with the temple gone, there was all these synagogues, throughout kind of the Roman Empire, and typically Jewish people, including Christian, followers of Jesus, people who were adhering to the Jewish faith, they would gather at the synagogues, and they would do it on a different day. They would do it on Sunday, and the reason they would do it on Sunday was because it was not in conflict with the non-Jesus following Jews who were honoring the Sabbath and stuff like that. Many of them, the Christians, were still honoring the Sabbath. Anyway, too much detail, but. So basically, this community that John's writing to is sort of feeling like double marginalized. The Romans are, they're oppressing everyone, who sort of loosely identifies with Judaism. But then the Christ followers are also sort of being excluded by the other Jewish denominations. So they've been kicked out of the synagogue. And so the context that John is writing and kind of recounting the story of Jesus is you have this incredibly, incredibly marginalized group, like double marginalized. And I bring that up only to give some context because in context, the takeaway from the book of John would have been one that was really, really liberating, and I'll sort of lay that out in just a moment. But the problem is, fast forward a couple thousand years, and the circumstances are different, and then the book of John often gets used to justify hate crimes and anti-Semitism and stuff like that. So I want to throw out that disclaimer just because context really matters when it comes to interpreting the Bible. Kind of like that video we showed of Pete Enns. Like, there's lots of viable interpretations of things, but some of them can be used and abused if we fail to understand the way that they were being understood and framed in their original setting. Hopefully that made sense. So what's happening here? So Jesus is saying that Nicodemus has to be born again, and why is that important? Well, it's important because kind of part and parcel, in some ways, this is an oversimplification, but a huge part of Judaism was understanding on some level that their identity, their salvation, their security in God was affirmed and confirmed because of their Jewish heritage. And so the idea that you must be born again is sort of undermining that thing that they were clinging to, that they were kind of holding on to in order to sort of justify themselves or feel secure over and against the world and over and against, quite frankly, their oppressors. And so hopefully you can see how delicate this is because in this passage, Jesus is providing encouragement to a community who's now being sort of oppressed and ostracized by both the Romans and their fellow Jews. But taken out of that context, then it mostly just sounds like Jesus is saying mean things about Jewish people. So it's delicate. But in context, and we're going to sort of translate this for our context in a moment, but in context, this is a really liberating idea that, at least for people who are feeling ostracized by the Jews, because they're like, okay, no, the thing that they're clinging to, the thing that you're clinging to, but it's also a really alienating idea because the thing that we have been clinging to is no longer the grounds, according to Jesus, for our security, for our salvation. So then follow this sequence kind of chronologically. So you have this community. First they lose the temple, which had been this magnificent symbol of their standing before God, destroyed. which was kind of surprising because they were expecting Jesus to return or someone to return kind of as God's regent or avatar or representative and like literally kind of politically, militarily kind of like kick out the Romans. That didn't happen. Quite the opposite, actually. So then they're beginning to try to reimagine or re-understand some of Jesus' promises to them and what it was going to mean for him to return. And then they get kicked out of the synagogue. So now they have like nothing to stand on except, kind of like their legacy within the, many 100,000, not 100,000, the 1,000, some odd year history of the Jewish faith. And then Jesus is coming and being like, no, clean slate, born again, start over. It's this sort of radical loss, this radical alienation, separation from all of the things that these people would have been clinging to secure themselves, to make themselves feel safe, to establish their identity, some sort of firm foundation in a harsh world. And Jesus is saying to be saved, to experience the life eternal, the life of the ages, to be what God always intended you to be, you kind of have to let go of all of that. Terrifying. Normally I'm hanging out in the book of Mark because I love the book of Mark because it literally ends. And it ends and they're like, and they were very terrified. Roll credits. It's like, that's great. John kind of holds your hand a little bit more, but still, what Jesus is literally saying here would have been, in their context, the most terrifying thing. It would look different in our context. Because we are often saved by different things, although not always. I mean, a huge aspect of this community has been beginning to mine the history of whiteness in the United States, and the way that the notion of white identity is something that's been completely made up, but then fostered and fabricated and built upon as a way of securing a certain group of people in the world over and against another group of people, and in fact, does so in a really insidious way because it takes a whole bunch of people who should be in solidarity with a whole bunch of other people, and it divides them and pits them against each other so that like 4 people, statistically speaking, over here reap all the rewards. But identity isn't the only thing that we cling to. We cling to vocation. We cling to status. We cling to experience, aptitude and ability, education. Instagram, the whole thing of Instagram, and I guess like TikTok now, not really my scene, but most of social media is a form of, it's almost like a digital temple. Like we don't need physical temples anymore because we have digital temples where we pay homage to our idols. And most of those idols are images. They're pictures, they're representations of the kind of life that we want to project into the world that we are leading or imagine ourselves leading in order to feel secure. Because if we stop and think about it, most of us don't feel secure. There might be fleeting moments where some sense of consistency, some sense of stability maybe sort of breaks forth. Many of us might have a stable job, a decent family situation. We might be okay, well off, but if not materially, and by that I mean like financially at the level of food and shelter and things like that, if not materially, and I don't want to presume that anyone here is necessarily secure on that front, but if not there, then at least emotionally, spiritually, existentially, we don't feel secure. There are so many things that we are bombarded with, that we pursue, that we fantasize about, that we think is going to bring about a kind of salvation, a kind of wholeness, a kind of final oneness that will make us feel at peace. And maybe some of us are coming from a tradition where on some level we knew that maybe that's not for this life, and so we've sort of been projecting those fantasies, those idolatries off into the post-mortem future, heaven. That's where we get that idea. And then for others of us, we're trying to live in the now. Heaven, that was a weird fairy tale from my conservative theological days. Now I'm more focused on, athleisure, or things like that. I don't know, that's just guessing for some of you. But something, some idol, some fantasy that we can imagine if and when we are able to achieve it will have arrived. I've got my own versions of this. Some of them are financial. Some of them are related to this sunroom that I'm trying to build on the back of my house, finally getting complete. We're 9 months into this project. It's a good metaphor for this talk this evening, or this morning actually. But point is, we all have our thing. We have our thing. And often it's unconscious, right? Yeah, I mean, if someone says like, what are your goals? Or what do you think is, what do you want to accomplish in life? Yeah, you can probably rattle off a list. Most of us are adults in here, but it might be some version of what do I want to be when I grow up? Because many of us have not yet achieved that thing. But then some of it's unconscious. Things that we pursue often without even realizing that we're doing it. And here's what happens. The structure of fantasy, any fantasy, is that on an unconscious level, our minds, our brains, our psyches, our subjectivity knows that this thing is not actually going to fulfill us. And in fact, it needs to not fulfill us because that's the thing that fuels us. If you get it, well, inevitably it'll be revealed as ultimately disappointing, ultimately unsatisfying. You've all experienced this because you've made a purchase in your life. Buyer's remorse. How many celebrities have been interviewed talking about the fleetingness of fame and fortune? And we sit there and we listen, and we're like, yeah, easy for you to say millionaire. But I don't think they're lying. I don't think it's some ruse to try to keep us from also being celebrities so that they can keep all the celebrity for themselves. There is something truly unfulfilling about reaching the mountaintop and finding out that I still feel the same way I've always felt. If anything, it's harder because everyone can see you. And there's this expectation that, well, you've made it, right? So you should be this or this or this. You should be happy. You should be generous. You should be X, fill in the blank. And that kind of pressure would be awful. And so here's what our unconsciouses do. We invent an obstacle, a scapegoat, a reason why we haven't achieved the fantasy. And the great thing about having an obstacle is it gives us something to blame while keeping the fantasy at arm's length. So that we can, as long as we keep it at arm's length, then we're safe. We don't actually have to get it and be disappointed by it. We can continue to fantasize about it and think that it's going to be this thing that's awesome, that's like heaven, that's going to make us feel great. And the fact that we don't have it, that's their fault. And we are very good at inventing scapegoats. Sometimes we take entire groups of people, immigrants, people who've been racialized differently or experience their sexuality or gender differently than us, people who are poorer or richer than us, and we say, they're the reason. And it's very useful because now we get to keep the fantasy. We get to continue to imagine that if only, fill in the blank, we will be saved. And God, if only that group or that person was not in the way, I would finally become my most authentic self. So we have our own version of what Nicodemus was struggling with. But I think the solution is actually pretty similar. And what is Jesus' solution? Die. Quite literally in his case, but hopefully more symbolically or metaphorically for us, but die. Die to that thing. Realize, without having to actually traverse the whole fantasy, realize that this thing is not actually going to save me. Realize that, in fact, the pursuit of this thing might in fact be the thing that's causing trauma to myself and certainly spilling over into the lives of others. Die to it. But then here's the beautiful thing about Christianity in its best forms. And don't get me wrong, I'm very, very aware that there are worst forms of it. But at its best, Christianity is a faith of resurrection. And crucially, resurrection takes for granted the whole death thing. It's not a reversal. It's not a walk back. It's not a dodge. It goes straight through and out the other side, something new. And that's terrifying. That's what Mark's getting at. That's what John's getting at. It's terrifying because it's alienating. We repress these things. We disavow them. Our finitude, our humanity, our flaws, our lack. We cover it over with filters or by saying no filter. We hide it. We run from it. And when we see it in other people, when we see ourselves in them, we condemn it, say harsh things to it, avoid it. So no, the death is terrifying, but it's a freedom. It's a certain kind of authenticity. To die to the fantasy, to die to the idolatry, to die to whatever it is that we've unconsciously or consciously imagined is going to save us. To die to our very attempts to save and secure ourselves in the world, typically over and against ourselves and over and against one another, is to be alienated but to be free. To be saved, to be authentic. And here's the most important part, and I promise we are getting back to baptism. It's not to be alone. Because here's Jesus' brilliant insight. This is universal. We are all idolatrous, fantasizing creatures because we are all trying to repress, disavow, run from, deny our very humanity. Our finitude, our finiteness, the fact that on some level we can imagine a gap between us and the divine. And the lie of the enemy, the lie of Satan in the narrative of the Bible has been that this is how you be like God. To know good and evil, to organize and order and separate the world along those terms so that you can get rid of the bad, the scapegoat, and then be left with the good. And so we pursue it. We chase it. Almost always at the expense of ourselves and certainly at the expense of others. Believing the lie that if we can just order the world properly, we will finally feel right. And so the gift, the salvation being offered in response to this, is one of death, dying to that fantasy and rising again to a radical authenticity that we actually happen to share, all of us together. It's in that collective alienation, in that collective freedom, that collective authenticity, that we can actually get together and struggle together, really believing that a different world is possible today. This was what you see in the book of Acts in the New Testament. Shedding all of these expectations, all of these things that they used to cling to in order to secure themselves, they were actually able to find true solidarity. They were finally free to be with and to be for one another. And literally the whole New Testament is about that is what it means to be the body of Christ. That is what it means to experience the presence of the Holy Spirit. We can still do that, but it's hard. And so that's what baptism was. It was this practice. Literally practice. Like, think about what the word practice means. We normally associate it with like music and sports and stuff like that. You practice because you're not actually a natural at doing the thing. So baptism was a practice. It was practicing death and resurrection. Probably before you felt like it was second nature, because death isn't really second nature for anyone. And so in that sense, it almost would make more sense, if we were being consistent about it, for baptism to be this thing that we do every week or maybe even every day, but that's impractical. Be a lot of water. So as I think about reimagining this for Watershed, as I think about kind of getting practical, what could this look like? Yeah, I think at some point, maybe it makes sense for us to begin to, we have this basin, it's in the basement, it's like 3,000 pounds. It takes about 12 people to move it. Maybe we'll get around to getting that back up here and doing something with it, but more immediately. What does it look like to practice this sort of alienating authenticity? Because, by the way, I want to be super clear here, like, if it wasn't obvious, that's what salvation is. That's what it means to participate in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, which is all Paul talks about. And he's like, I'm crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. To live is Christ, to die is gain. He's talking about to be saved is to die, hopefully, again, symbolically, existentially, but die to our attempts to save ourselves, not in like the total depravity Calvinist way, but like die to all of these not die to the insecurities, but die to our attempt to disavow those insecurities, die to our attempts to save ourselves, which almost always means trampling on ourselves and others, being totally free, totally alienated in this authenticity, and realizing in that moment that is when we are least alone, because it's all of us together. And then we're free to be with and for each other, just as God is with and for us. It's incarnational. It's Jesus, Emmanuel. If you go into my Facebook, I'm talking today on Halloween about it's the first day of the holiday season. I love Christmas, Emmanuel. This is what we get to embody together. So what would this look like? I think two things. Yeah, again, we might get to the water eventually, but here's where we are right now as a community, collectively. 2 commitments. 1, show up. That's the practice. Show up. And here's why. Here's why you show up, because that's what practice is. It's before the thing is second nature. Before the thing is second nature, you got to just rehearse it. You got to show up. It's almost kind of fake it till you make it. That's what I'm asking us to do. Fake it till I make it. Because what is making it look like? That's number 2, is authenticity, vulnerability. That is truly what we all share. And when we feel the kind of alienating freedom, traumatic, terrifying freedom, but when we feel the freedom to really show up as our vulnerable, authentic selves, I promise you that what we find is that that's all of us. And there is something beautiful, something truly divine when we can get to that point. But it is hard, even for those of us who have maybe grazed it. It's hard to show up that way every day. It's terrifying. It's terrifying. So we do it together. You're not doing this for yourself. I mean, a little bit, and that's fine. Do it for yourself. But we're doing it for one another. We are showing up. We are faking it till we make it all together, all of us, knowing that, trusting that if we consistently and continually do it, something will burst forth. Something real. Something that looks like Jesus. And if it looks like Jesus, in all of his contradictions, all of his humanity, his finitude, his finiteness, his quirks and foibles, if it looks like us, and it looks like Jesus, then the Bible tells us it looks like God, which means it looks like us participating in the divine, which is all salvation is. And all baptism is asking us and inviting us to practice together. So, as we continue the series, as we kind of pivot towards the end of this year into the holiday season, that's the challenge, that's the invitation. Show up. Just show up. And when you do, take a chance at authenticity. Take a chance at vulnerability. Take a chance at baptism. It might surprise you. Grace and peace.